Psyfeld. This morning's discussion will focus on the sniffing accountant. So where would the group like to start?
I guess this is not the main plot line, but I found the whole situation with I don't know, I don't watch Seinfeld, so I don't know her name, Elaine, I think.
Yeah. Good.
The whole situation with her like being mad at her boyfriend that he didn't use the exclamation point when she was mentioning that when he had left the message that her friend had a baby, and she went on and like really made a big deal out of that. So I found that a little funny.
So again, in a vacuum, I think, and this, since it is your first week in psychiatry, we're going to be, and you have for the past 4 days, been consulted on different cases throughout the hospital. Despite the fact that in each of these occasions, there was a hospitalist or another faculty member contacting this office for a psychiatric evaluation, I would still ask that you walk into that room and approach the identified behavior as completely normal. Even though the team that's calling us up, pediatrics, surgery, etc., is telling us that it is not by the mere nature that they're contacting us. And this would also hold true in the outpatient setting. So a person calls your office to make an appointment to see you as a mental health care provider. They enter that office, anything they say, anything they do is completely normal until proven otherwise. Now, if that happens within 5 seconds or 5 weeks, doesn't matter. I will also ask, especially if you're going into psychiatry, that no matter how many times you're proven wrong in approaching the situation as complete normalcy or something that is culturally sanctioned, do not get lulled into the aspect of saying, I'm tired of doing this. These behaviors are clearly abnormal. I practice in a psychiatry clinic. Don't do that, right? Because keeping it, quote unquote, normal, at least in terms of how the individual presents, whether it's Elaine, or whether it's a real patient, consult service, other, really allows you to maintain an unconditional positive regard and in the practice of patient-centered medicine. Elaine, okay? This is completely normal. Now, in the situation where you didn't self-disclose that you don't know Seinfeld and you don't know Elaine, but instead watched all 9 seasons, and we picked up a pattern, often referred to as a pervasive pattern of behavior, we're onto something, right? They're onto something because with patterns, there is increased risk of whatever the behavior is, the exclamation point, the arguing or the discontent with her partner, resulting in clinically significant distress or impairment. Because as soon as that threshold is reached, we can use the word disorder. All right. So in this situation, coming from someone not only as a psychiatrist, but someone who has watched every episode more than once, I can assure you, collateral information, that Elaine's behavior is in fact a pattern, and it does in fact result in clinically significant distress, specifically with her interprofessional relationships. So now that we're here, what are your thoughts?
Well, we do kind of see it impacting her work when her boss calls her in and he's like, why do you have 1,000 exclamation points in your draft, right? All to do with like proving her point. But to speak to that like more pervasive pattern, we've talked about how Elaine has a lot of issues with the people that she dates. So she almost is self-sabotaging her relationship in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So here we're looking at 2 aspects of Elaine's life, and these are not mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. We have a common variable here, and it happens to be the very thing you picked up on. And what you picked up on adversely impacting both her interprofessional relations, or interpersonal, I should say, relationships, as well as her vocational functioning, right? So at this point, we're going to probably use the word disorder, but now the entire DSM is in front of us. No idea what chapter to get to. Any other observation of Elaine in this particular episode?
I don't know if it was like, I might have just kept like watching accidentally, like into the next episode. But like Elaine and like Jerry and all, they kind of all go to the friend who like delivered the baby, and they were just like not that excited. So I thought it was kind of an interesting like juxtaposition where she's like, you have to be so excited and have these exclamation points, and then when they're actually like in the hospital watching the baby and they're like, what's going on? So it kind of seemed like out of proportion.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was thinking that she never called a friend back. We never saw her call a friend back. We never saw her like mention it again. And if it was her coming in telling me the story, I would think it's interesting that she focused only on her relationship and not on her friendships, because, you know, the other updates.
Continue. So what else are we noticing here? I mean, you identified someone who says one thing, appears to later on in the episode do another.
Mhm.
And the scene in which you're discussing with regard to her friend and her friend's baby is obviously something that individuals would get excited for your friend.
Right.
And there seems to be an incapacity to do that. So what are we talking about here? It could be, right? What's the clinical term? We can't use the H word in the clinical note. What do we call it when an individual can't share in another individual's space? Or how about we say when they do? What is the capacity to actually share the feelings of others? Yeah, yeah. This is a character without empathy. Right? She is actually incapable. She has an incapacity to share in the joy of her friend. Right? The clinical term that often describes the opposite, the antithesis, would be egocentrism.
Mhm.
Egocentrism. Where does egocentrism, when is it teased out? Or when is empathy teased out? Because we were all egocentric once, right? When? Yeah, right? So everybody understands, nobody's gonna counter this, but please, if you feel I'm wrong, I would love to know your personal history. But at some point, you did function as if the world revolved around you. And we have our primary caretaker to thank for that, right? And in a very good way. Today is International Women's Day. This is largely your mother, right? She made you aware, likely, that you were the center of the world. And then one day you found out you weren't, right? Despite your mother's best efforts, right? At some point, you realized other. Now, there are more than one textbooks, or plural, dozens of textbooks written on this in terms of self versus other. As early on in child development that we're talking about, the loss of egocentrism, which also means the onset of empathy. It is also reasonable to assume that someone who is, as an adult, is lacking empathy, and that lack of empathy is resulting in clinically significant distress or impairment, may have had something go awry during this critical developmental phase or window, right? So now we don't have the prequel to this, right? Again, I keep on saying this, I say this every clerkship rotation. Larry David has the light go on, the Netflix series that shows the prequel to these characters, early childhood, highlighting the Costanzas, the Seinfeld's parents. Is a blockbuster. Nonetheless, we could trace this back to early childhood development. So we probably don't have a diagnostic label that's simple to slap on here, but I could tell you that if this individual were to come to clinical attention, that psychotherapy and examining those past relationships and how they impact adult relationships, vocational, interpersonal, would be, I think, part of the treatment plan. Questions or other observations about Elaine?
Very quick to disregard Jerry and Kramer's idea about the sniffing account. Like very much it was like, no, you guys are just off on your own in this world. Like very not entertaining the idea.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that often these characters own egocentrism in some form of irony, comedic irony, forms a reality check for other that are also going through the same thing. So these four friends play off one another. Somehow Elaine seems to be the focus of reality here, where in a subsequent scene, previous scene, the exact opposite is true. So yeah, there's some irony there. But let's go with your observation. What is Jerry's thoughts about the sniffing accountant?
It seemed a little like catastrophizing, like just a worry that just escalated from 0 to 100 basically in a second. That was a chemist doing drugs.
I think two teaching points here. One, you've already, I know in the first 4 days of your clerkship have already arrived at, but it's, I think, great to review just a micro didactic on this, and that is deficits that perhaps are uncovered by the routine mental status examination. So the MSE or mental status examination has multiple components, and one of them is thought content. Right now, thought content itself sometimes is categorized or subcategorized as quote unquote killer endings versus themes. Right, the killer endings and the killer endings terminology is largely the product of an acronym, right? ABC stamp licker from brain calipers. I didn't make that one up. But the KE stands for killer endings, right? Suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation. Then you have themes. Themes include a continuum of thought deficit or deficit in thought content, ranging from the quote unquote normal to the most severe quote unquote abnormal. The first of which, mildest form, is the overvalued idea. So now we're on one side of the continuum. Arbitrarily, the overvalued idea does not result in clinically significant distress or impairment. Right. In layperson's terms, we might refer to this as a superstition. Then we have the most severe of deficit in thought content. Any guess as to what the clinical label of this is? The delusion. The individual who has a delusion meets several required criteria. Number one, that there is clinically significant distress or impairment, which clearly separates it from the overvalued idea. The other noteworthy distinction of the delusion is that it is not, that this particular thought is not reality-based and is rigid, right? And you do need both of those, right? Because if you say something that is not reality-based and then are provided evidence to the contrary, the individual who says, oh, okay, that makes sense, does not have a delusion. So rigidity is part of the definition of a delusion. Then we have all these intermediate terms. So they separate out from the overvalued idea in that they also result in clinically significant distress or impairment. However, there is some insight that allows you to say that this is not delusional. And so they're intermediate terms. Some of these terms could be, or could include rumination, preoccupation, and obsession. Okay. For all intents and purposes, for today, let's just say we'll use those three terms interchangeably. I just want to make the point that they separate out from the mildest form, that overvalued idea, as well as separate out from the most severe form, that delusion. All right, so, and not really sure where Jerry lies in this continuum, but certainly what your observation entailed is a quick review of these deficits in thought content that could be actually uncovered by a routine mental status examination. Right. Of course, there's the content of Jerry's thought, or in this case, drugs, right? So what drug or drugs does Jerry concerned that his accountant is using? Cocaine? Do they actually say cocaine in the, no. Yeah.
I think it was,
Yeah.
That's no blower.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's cocaine. All right. All right, so on a shelf exam, it's never too early to talk about the shelf. What are the, how well, I mean, let me rephrase the question. How will cocaine intoxication appear on your shelf exam? What's the vignette gonna look like?
hypertension, something-year-old comes in.
Pinpoint?
High energy.
Opposite? Oh, dilated?
Or like
You think
a
of
heart
heroin?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Cocaine intoxication on the shelf exam is clinically indistinguishable from a heart attack, which means that it's clinically indistinguishable from a panic attack. So a patient presents with a vignette, A, acute MI, B, panic attack, 3, cocaine intoxication. There's no way you could tell me you know the answer. All right, so you're gonna have to look now for evidence of pertinent positives and pertinent negatives that allows you to choose A versus B versus C. Right? In clinical practice, it's an acute MI until proven otherwise. Of course, when the EKG returns and the serum markers return normal, maybe sinus tachycardia, but that's it. You can rule out an acute MI. Right? But you still have panic attack versus cocaine intoxication. Let's say there's no further evidence provided. What is the single best answer here? So you've crossed out A. It's not an acute MI. Serum markers are normal, and the EKG only shows sinus tachycardia. No further information is given in your vignette. Choice B is panic attack. Choice C, cocaine intoxication. Yeah, you do not diagnose a mental disorder until you've definitively ruled out that a disorder due to the direct and physiologic effects of a substance. So in the hypothetical that no further information is provided, cocaine intoxication is the single best answer. What does cocaine withdrawal look like? It looks like a major depressive episode. Yeah, matter of fact, if you look at what the 4 criteria for cocaine withdrawal, they're part of SIGI-CAPS, right? Which we know as the acronym that highlights a major depressive episode. There is one outlier, which if you had a question writer that really wanted to spoon feed this to you, they would include. However, they could just simply exclude it from the clinical vignette and you'd still have to identify cocaine withdrawal. What's the one criterion for cocaine withdrawal that it does not appear in SIGI-CAPS? No, unfortunately, there is no physiologic withdrawal phase. It's all behavioral. Now, again, generally speaking, intoxication states, withdrawal phases have both psychological / behavioral as well as physiologic. When you look at the DSM, the psychological sequelae are contained in the text. The bulleted actual criterion are always physiologic. In this case, since there are no physiologic, the American Psychiatric Association did bullet the behavioral, hence why it looks like SIGI-CAPS. That's to say, for the medical management of cocaine withdrawal, that is what we often refer to as detox, none of the above. There is no detoxification. There is no medical management of cocaine withdrawal because there is no physiologic cocaine withdrawal. It is all behavioral / psychological. Behavioral / psychological. That's what I meant. SIGI-CAPS, with the exception of vivid dreams. Okay. Vivid dreams is included in the diagnostic criteria of cocaine withdrawal. It does not appear in the definition of a major depressive episode. So what is the treatment then for cocaine withdrawal? Yeah, it's a magic word when doctors don't know what they're doing, or when there's not evidence-based data to support what they do. It's supportive treatment, right? And what is the largest or what is the most important supportive measure to take here? Well, that's going to be core. But there's even one that's more important than that in this treatment plan for cocaine withdrawal.
Safe space so that there's no suicidal.
That's exactly right. Suicidality. That's the one thing you have to really be concerned about in treatment planning for cocaine withdrawal. Exactly right. Supportive treatment and the specific supportive treatment would be to monitor suicidality closely. Right. Questions about cocaine intoxication or cocaine withdrawal? By the way, supportive measures are also indicated in cocaine intoxication, right? Because of the hyperadrenergic state, but otherwise no specific therapies. Any questions about either cocaine or stimulant intoxication in general or stimulant withdrawal? All right, any other characters? We have about 5 minutes left. Any other characters you'd like to discuss this morning from the sniffing account?
It was interesting seeing George's parents, we talked about like experiences before. But seeing how they have like this strange triad dynamic for the three of them. The mom is always very like almost overbearingly supportive of George, and the dad is kind of just almost the opposite in a lot of ways. I think it explains a lot of his like difficulties in functioning, that like he gets his job and he's like impulsively touches already sweater because he had heard someone else did it, and so he assumed it was fine, and it led down this whole route of issues. And I think it just kind of shows that George's upbringing impacts his interpersonal functioning very negatively.
It absolutely does, yeah, yeah. And those early childhood relationships of the Costanzas are the impetus of my making the comment that I did in terms of the Netflix series. I mean, I mentioned also that we have an undergraduate internship that is remotely actually following us today. They're the 20 or so that are currently on Zoom. Well, a prior class just this past fall semester, as a legacy project, began the outline of an entire curriculum based on George Costanza. You could cover every single psychopathology, or at least chapter in the DSM, by just talking about various episodes that highlight this particular character's behavior. That's how incredibly dysfunctional he is. And unlike others, and Jerry Seinfeld is the one that comes up in the example here, unlike others, really defies a single diagnosis, right? The artificial nature in which we categorize behavior and therefore abnormal behavior. You can't do that with George. No matter what episode you're talking about a different illness, right? Which in clinical practice obviously would be very disconcerting, but in an academic circle, incredibly rewarding. I mean, this character is very, very academically dense. All right, we'll leave it here. We're going to take just a couple of minutes and then log back on to have table rounds.